It was shocking, but I could almost say it was necessary. It was necessary both for Trump to realize that Zelensky was not just simply coming as a supplicant on bended knee to the court of King Trump to do whatever he was told. This is a monstrously colonial type of deal. But again, frankly, it's a fantasy deal. It's built around this notion of the exploitation of Ukrainian resources that can only happen after the war is over. This is something that has rattled Moscow. I think he overestimates his capacity to be a sort of Trump wrangler. He's greedy. He always thinks, oh, we can get a little bit more. We just hold out a little bit longer, we can get an even better deal or something. But anyway, for whatever reason, that seems to have died the death. To understand what's been happening over Ukraine, and particularly in terms of Trump's posture, you've got to understand how he, and ironically enough, Vladimir Putin, see the way the world works. They both ultimately have a very 19th century sense of geopolitics. You go back to the age before, really there was international law at any meaningful level, before there were these sort of power blocks, before we even had a sense of ethical foreign policy, frankly. Back to the age of, the height of colonialism, when in effect the world was divided between a relative handful of powers who made the decisions and shaped the rules, and the rest of the world where, frankly, the only real question was who owns you, or at least who tells you what to do. So that sense of a world that is divided between those who give and those who take orders, very much at the heart of Putin's worldview. It's one of the reasons why, for example, he can't cope with the idea of Ukraine forging its own path and getting closer to Europe and the West generally, because he would see that as Russia losing Ukraine and the West gaining it. It's almost as if it's some kind of board game. Well, Trump also sees, I think, the world in that kind of sense. It's less formed and less formal than the way Putin would put it. But nonetheless, on a visceral level, he ultimately thinks that might makes right. And powerful nations get to tell what he sees of as weaker nations what to do. I mean, it's clear that, for example, in his dealings with Canada, for example, or Mexico, there is that sense of, they should realize that they're in the United States' sphere of influence. And to a degree, Washington ought to be able to tell them what to do. They seem to have, for some strange reason, different ideas. So when we apply this to what's been happening in Ukraine, at first Trump approached it from the point of view of, in some ways, why on earth are we getting involved? Of course, Ukraine is going to be part of Russia's sphere of influence. The idea that the Ukrainians might have sovereignty and might have their own agency in this didn't really seem to have occurred to him. So, of course, this is going to be Russia's sphere of influence. Why are we spending all this money and political capital fighting a war that, in any case, doesn't look like either side is really going to win, or at the very least, it certainly seems impossible for the Ukrainians to win. Therefore, let's make a deal. His real favourite word in the English language, deal. The idea that, essentially, you can give Putin what is already his, but extract some kind of concession from it. Now, that really hasn't been working for all kinds of reasons, but also because the Ukrainians themselves have been changing how they engage with Trump. I mean, we saw in the ghastly and now infamous meeting in the Oval Office, which ended up in more or less a shouting match between Volodymyr Zelensky, Donald Trump, and Vice President J.D. Vance. In some ways, that was, yes, it was shocking, but I could almost say it was necessary. It was necessary both for Trump to realize that Zelensky was not just simply coming as a supplicant on bended knee to the court of King Trump to do whatever he was told, but also, I think, for the Ukrainians to realize that you have to play a very different kind of politics with this White House. You can't expect to morally shame them or just assume that they're going to understand who's the good guy and who's the bad in this circumstance. And I think the crucial element of this was the resources deal, which the Ukrainians now have signed, waiting for it to be ratified. In that, this is a monstrously colonial type of deal. It gives the United States rights to access to Ukrainian resources that really ought to be just purely Ukraine's. It will also, to a degree, actually squeeze out other countries, such as Britain and the European Union, from the same kind of opportunities. But again, frankly, it's a fantasy deal. It's built around this notion of the exploitation of Ukrainian resources that can only happen after the war is over. No one is going to start thinking about building mines and pumping oil from new sources when a Russian drone can turn up at any moment just to sort of ruin your day. So in some ways, what this is the Ukrainians essentially pitching themselves to Trump as an economic vassal of the United States. And I think this is what seems to be changing his calculus. That sense of, hang on a minute, maybe this is not just a pointless squabble over a territory that is Russia's. Maybe actually this is a business opportunity for USA Incorporated. And in that respect, I think, as in so many other ways, Volodymyr Zelensky and his administration has proven pretty capable at how to manipulate, play, or whatever, various Western countries to get them on side. We don't know if this is going to last and how it's going to work out. But nonetheless, this does seem to be the sort of key point. It's not about geopolitics. It's not about morality. It's just that sense of maybe there's a new vassal who can be bought and who has already been, in effect, paid for by all this American assistance that has been provided since the start of the war. One of the interesting things about this resources deal is how it's being played in the Russian press. Now, the Russian press, it's not quite Soviet in approach, but nonetheless, pretty much every single newspaper and other media outlet is either state-controlled or, shall we say, state-influenced. It might be technically independent, but particularly on crucial issues, they clearly are given a line. There's a system of what are called tyomniki, which are these little sort of briefing notes that are sent out from the presidential administration to the editors of the main news outlets, saying, these are the stories we want you to be looking at, these are the stories we don't want you to be looking at, and these are the kind of lines we want you to take. And it's really been very striking to the degree to which there has been a fairly common line in the Russian press about this deal, essentially and ironically saying how bad for Ukraine it is. I mean, to be perfectly honest, so too is actually being under constant Russian missile and drone fire. But that doesn't seem to bother them quite so much. So clearly this is something that has rattled Moscow. And I think it is precisely because one of the things they do have is something of a handle on how Trump thinks about the world. And as soon as this, as it were, Ukraine can be thought of in these balance sheet terms as a potential profit line rather than a liability, that's the point at which Trump gets interested and wants to really ensure that he keeps his teeth into something that he can then point to as a success. So, although even this deal is still currently under negotiation, there are two additional so-called technical documents that have to be finalized, which in many ways will actually really nail down all the detail. But certainly, if one just takes the main document as it stands, this is not something that leaves the Russians happy, because exactly what it is in effect doing is mortgaging Ukraine to the United States. And then from the Russians' point of view, what happens? How will Trump react if the Russians continue to burn down a property that Trump has mortgaged? The Kremlin barred me from Russia in June 2022 as the first batch of Brits who were indefinitely no longer allowed in Russia because of our alleged Russophobic activity. It's probably one of many reasons why Vladimir Putin did not ask me for advice on what he should do with the ceasefire deal that Trump offered. But nonetheless, although there was a sneaking sense that this would be the case, I was still surprised that Putin did not essentially bite Trump's hand off with the eagerness to take this deal, which did not give him everything he wanted. It's worth noting it didn't include any limitations on Ukraine's military, which is something the Russians had wanted. It essentially meant that the bulk of Ukraine, the 80% that is not under occupation, could now become a sovereign nation. Apart from not being able to join NATO, it was free to join the European Union, form other alliances, even invite foreign troops onto its soil, which was a big change. But nonetheless, the opportunity not just to essentially end the war in control of 20% of Ukraine, to be able to claim that this was a great triumph, that because after all you've been facing not just Ukraine but the whole of the West, to have the United States formally recognize Crimea, occupied, invaded Crimea, as Russian territory, with all the recriminations within the West and the weaknesses of international law that would provide, and total sanctions lifting. I mean, that was an astonishing sort of gift, frankly, that Trump was offering, the lifting of all American sanctions. Nonetheless, Putin, for his own reasons, chose not to accept that. Probably because I think he overestimates his capacity to be a sort of Trump wrangler. He's greedy. He always thinks, oh, we can get a little bit more. We just hold out a little bit longer. We can get an even better deal or something. But anyway, for whatever reason, that seems to have died the death. And I don't see much likelihood that the Americans are going to come back. I mean, they have explicitly said we're no longer going to run around the globe trying to negotiate. Basically, we're out of this. So I think, frankly, the chances of a ceasefire in the immediate future are very, very slender. The big uncertainty is, what does walking away from all this mean? Is it that the Americans, as they had threatened at first, end their intelligence support for Ukraine, which provides a lot of key targeting information, which helps them the Ukrainians launch these long-range attacks deep into Russia against military logistical targets? Does it mean that they end their provision of military support? And because after all, modern warfare is incredibly voracious, not just in its need for ammunition, but even things like spare parts. It's all very well having these M1 Abrams and Bradley personnel carriers and other pieces of kit being provided, but these things are going to break down. These things are going to need a constant supply, and maybe it actually becomes harder and harder to keep them in the field. And of course, financial support. We shouldn't forget the degree to which actually this is not just about keeping the Ukrainian military fighting, it's also about keeping the Ukrainian economy afloat. The resources deal, in some ways, it suggests that actually Trump isn't thinking of just walking away totally. But with Trump, we don't know. This is the fundamental problem, the fundamental exasperation, shall we say. Pundits like me, we're asked to give clear, straight, unambiguous answers. What's going to happen next week and next month? And the bottom line is, I don't know. Because I don't think Trump himself necessarily knows. This is not someone who has long-term, clearly articulated strategic plans and sticks to them. We saw this with the flip-flopping over tariffs, most strikingly. When it comes down to it, despite the fact that there are still people, Vice President J.D. Vance seeming to be among them, who do actually continue to articulate the idea that America should just pull back. If the Europeans want to help step up their support for Ukraine, fine, but it's not America's problem. However, we do know that there have been a lot of people within the administration who want to see Ukraine supported, who've been fighting a rearguard action. Zelensky himself seems to have been able to make some inroads, especially with this very televisual meeting in the Vatican, to actually begin to win Trump over. And Putin has not really been in the competition. He hasn't offered any sort of recent little trinkets or unsolicited praise or anything like that. So I think at the moment it looks as if America will continue at some level at least to be supporting Ukraine. Now, whether that ends up being stepped up because Trump decides that Putin has indeed taken him to be basically a mark, or whether it actually just slowly withers on the vine because there's no great enthusiasm to be dumping more money in Ukraine, it's impossible at this stage to guess.